Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nina, and I'm the Curator of Programs and Interpretation at the Williams College Museum of Art. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the third program in our summer series of Curatorial Close Looks. I'm so delighted to introduce today's series, which features artist, scholar, educator, and curator Amalia Mesa-Bains, as well as Lisa Dorin, WCMA's Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs and the curator of our upcoming exhibition, Sweaty Concepts. Before I turn it over to Amalia and Lisa, I have just a few quick notes about today's program, which will run just a little over an hour. We will be taking questions throughout the second half of the program today, so please do send your questions over to us at any point through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. And if you do have any technical questions or need any assistance, do send questions along through the chat feature and we'll do our best to help you as best we can. Live captioning is also available during the program today and can be turned on or off through the live transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom navigation, and that button has a CC on it. The presentation today is also being recorded and will be available on the museum's website and YouTube channel. And for those of you with connections to the region now called the Berkshires, I would also like to call us together before we begin the program today in a recognition that Williams College resides on the ancestral, spiritual, and unceded lands of the people whose waters are never still, also known as the Mohican tribe. And as always, I would really very much encourage all of you joining us this afternoon from various regions all over the country and the world to learn about the Indigenous people of your own areas and communities. I am now delighted to turn things over to Lisa and Amalia. Lisa is going to start us off with a bit of context about the upcoming Sweaty Concepts exhibition, which features work from WCMA's collections. And Lisa will then turn things over to Amalia, who will speak about her installation, The Library of Sorwana, Inez de la Cruz, originally created as a site-specific piece for WCMA in 1994, and which will be included in the upcoming Sweaty Concepts show. And we'll then open things up for dialogue between Amalia and Lisa, and we will take audience questions throughout that time. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to turn things over to Lisa Dorin.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you everybody for joining us out in Zoom land today. And Amalia, also, thank you very much for joining Nina and me in conversation. To start us off, I thought I would just say a little bit about the exhibition, Sweaty Concepts, and how the research for that show really brought us here today. The exhibition was born out of a nationwide consortium of institutions that came together really under the umbrella of the Feminist Art Coalition. And we all committed to developing projects that were inspired by feminisms in the lead up to the 2020 election. And at that time, I began mining our collection with that lens in mind. And I was inspired by a passage in Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life, in which she names a sweaty concept as the labor of describing a body that is not at home in the world. This exhibition, Sweaty Concepts, developed out of this process of digging into our contemporary holdings and listening to what the works had to say about making a space in a world that is set up to keep a lot of people out. And it turns out there were a lot of works, nearly 60, and they had a lot to say on this topic. And I knew your work, Amalia, had definitely a lot to say, but I could find very little information in our records that would help me understand how the work should be shown today. I mean, your installation from 1994 was kind of legendary in my mind. I had read about it. I had often heard about it from the colleagues at WCMA who had worked on it with you or had seen it as students. But I had never really understood how the objects we had in the collection now related to the original installation or how one would show it outside of that original context. And so it was my great delight when curator Esther Fernandez contacted me to request this work for your upcoming survey. And I was more than happy to lend it. But I also took advantage of the moment to ask if maybe you'd be willing to connect with me and help me understand how to display the work in our collection in a way that was kind of true to your artistic vision as much as possible. And that led to a tremendously enlightening conversation that the two of us had on Zoom a couple of months ago. And Nina and I really thought that there were a lot more people who might enjoy hearing about it too. So with that, Amalia, can I ask you to walk us through some images of the Venus Envy Chapter 2 exhibition and the library of Sorwana Inez de la Cruz that was part of that installation, and then reflect with us on how the project came to be, what your experience at Williams, how you're thinking about this work in relation to your upcoming survey, and any other thoughts that you might have while we look at pictures.
Hey, well, I want to begin by saying that my residency at Williams was one of the most enjoyable I've ever had. I'm not, I believe it or not, as an installation or spatiality is not one of my great strengths. So I sent all these sketches for the show, and when I got there, nothing had been built, and I didn't understand. And they explained to me that they thought perhaps I hadn't understood the size of the room and that I had made something that was actually much too small. So this chapter of Venus Envy, which has been my ongoing autobiography or autotopography, as the scholar Jennifer Williams has coined it, is called The Harem and Other Enclosures. Venus Envy is really basically my 3D interpretation of stages of my life. And I had visited the Harem Istanbul at the third biennial and fell in love with it and began thinking about how it embodied the concept of women together. So this opening image is the image of the section of that was the harem, but there were 3 sections. The harem sort of constitutes the idea of the body. The Virgin's Garden constitutes the feelings of spirituality. And the last piece, which we will focus on more today, was the library Sorwana Inez de la Cruz that was really about the mind. So we can go to the next slide. So this is Sorwana's library, which interestingly enough, I constructed at Williams, but in fact had been in conversation with some of the Latino women students at Williams prior to my visit, who had been protesting and lobbying for more Latino art courses. And I can use the word Latinx, but at that time we were using the word Latino. So I recreated my imaginary version of Sorwana Inez de la Cruz's library. She was a 17th century scholar who was well known for her brilliance and intelligence as both a poet, a writer, and a musicologist, and somewhat interested in the sciences. So she had at that time, in what was called New Spain, a cloistered life as a Jeremite nun, but she was able to keep a library of over 4,000 books, her own laboratory and musical studio. So this is my interpretation of it, and we'll look at details of it next. When dealing with Sarwana, she was an old friend of mine in a certain sense. When I worked on my PhD, I always had her portrait. She'd been painted by many, many different artists from Spain. Cabrera was one of them. And so I kept her image over my desk. And I had done a smaller version of this as an altar to her at the Mexican Museum in the early 80s. So this was me redeveloping a relationship with Sorwana's life as an embodiment. I want to say that part of what I've done in the kind of historicizing of women through homenajes, such as Sorwana's library, is really to inhabit the life of that individual as a means of acquiring some of the sensibility and skills. So you see her desk. I created a folding book, an open book for her. I created objects on the desk that had to do with some of her various interests, but also which were my interpretation of Latino issues of population. That was following the AIDS crisis, the whole problem of the dropout in public schools. So I had a tremendous amount of data that I factored in from a contemporary perspective of what Sorwana would be thinking about at that time in the 90s. Next. One of the aspects of it, as I mentioned earlier, was working with young students at Williams. And so I had by that time finished an earlier piece in Cornell and others in which I started building reading rooms when I did installations on university campuses, because I knew that I had an opportunity to engage intellectually and politically with some of the students. So the books that are on the reading table are part of an earlier series I did at Cornell, but I added to it materials that the women from Williams College, the students, had sent to me. So you see hooks on the back wall with pieces hanging, and I took stills from the videos these students had sent to me over their protests, and I factored them in as kind of surrogate Sorwanas as students and intellectuals. Next. Another familiar piece, which is jokingly called the Autopsy Chair. It began on another piece. So that's one of the aspects of my artwork, is that I do recycle pieces as I build narratives that come out of sometimes earlier pieces. This Autopsy Chair was from a show called Undiscovering America, which was a lead up to the quincentennial in 1990. And I was looking at the process of what I call the invasion of the Spanish. And so the chair was once again the body, and the cuts in it are the wounds of patriarchal colonialism. So it seemed appropriate because Sarwana herself, writing in the 1600s, or writing in Nahuatl and as well as in Spanish, and sometimes about the whole aspect of Spanish occupation. Next. She was a fierce woman, Sorwana, so I brought my grandmother, Mariana Escobedo Mesa, into the installation. And these are my grandmother's eyes. I love these images because in Spanish, when someone is going to have a child, you say que va dar luz, that she's going to bring light into the world. And the light in my grandmother Mariana's eyes is the impending birth of my father, Lorenzo Mesa, whose historicizing and storytelling was always a part of my childhood and drove many of my earlier installations. Next. When developing this piece, the Virgin's Garden, which we may see some images of later, each of these sections had a book that introduced the visitor to that image and set of images. I also wrote very frequently on the walls, which I started in the Venus Every Chapter 1 at the Little Whitney. I like annotating work right on the walls, and much of what appears to be wallpaper behind it, it was a kind of faux wainscoting that we hand rolled on, which was jeweled and had a line of leaves in the garden. Next. And this is from the harem, and this was another aspect of the folding books, which also had the monjas coronadas, which are the flowered nuns, which would have been in the time of Sorwana. And I think that's all of the ones we're looking at for now. So this piece was for me, oh, here are a few others. The images in the mirror, I think, are important to look at, if we can go back to that slide, because this is my interpretation of Sorwana's portraits. So she was painted by a number of artists. Cabrera is the one in the center. The ones on the side are other monjas coronadas, or flowered nuns. She wrote a wonderful poem, not to Cabrera, but to an earlier painter, in which she chastises for him for trying to play to her vanity, because she was in fact quite beautiful and went into the convent at a very early age. She was well known as a genius. They brought people from all over Europe to question her in areas of science and literature and history. So this piece was all ready to go. It's a triptych mirror, and you may see a kind of distortion at the top of the central mirror. As I was getting ready to pack it, the mirror slipped off my work table, flew into the air because it had kind of wings on the side, landed on the floor on its back, and cracked from the middle of her head out. And I panicked and thought I wouldn't be able to send it. And then I realized that what had happened to her, which in a short way of saying it, She was suppressed by the patriarchy of the church, forced to give up her library and her studies, and to go out and treat other nuns with smallpox, and died in her 30s. So what I discovered from the crack in the mirror coming out of her head was that, in fact, it was a reflection, pardon the pun, of the amount of struggle that she had had to go through in her short life to maintain an intellectual practice. So we can go to the next slide now. These are details from the harem, and you can see more closely that, unbeknownst to me, I selected images that turned out to be in the Clark Museum, which has a wonderful collection of Orientalism. And so these images, which show through from the back of the mirror, are in fact images that European painters did of the harem. And the veils that go over the top of the images were part of the signs that women in the harem used to send messages to their loved ones when they were allowed to go out on carriage rides or picnics. So each of the colored veils means something different, like "I still love you," or "this has to end." They had various messages, so I introduced those into the harem. The Virgin's Garden, this was part of one of the joys of being at Williams, was a kind of collective enterprise working with the registrar and some of the curatorial assistants. I was able to construct this from garden trellises that we bought nearby, and we went out and hunted for foliage, which we cut down, sometimes without permission, but it was in a wild area of the region, and we wove them through. So you see the triptych mirror of the Virgin, you see the armoire with the Virgin's clothes, and behind it a photo blow up of the Master of Frankfurt's Garden painting of the enclosed garden. And this is the humorous aspect of my fumbling through this. In preparation, someone sent me the image, but they told me about it first by a phone call, and he called it the Hortos Conclusos, or enclosed garden. But not hearing well, I thought he said the closed garden. And for years, I'd had this fantasy that all of these images of the Virgin's clothing in various postcards, the religious postcard I collected, could all be put into a closet, and she would rush in and out, changing her garments. Well, when the image arrived, I realized that it was an enclosed garden, but I had gone too far. I'd already had my mother making capes and gowns and rays and scepters. And so I maintained the closed garden within the Virgin's garden. Next. And this is a detail of the closed garden. My mother is gone now, but I love looking at these little capes and thinking of the tradition, which is still practiced in the Catholic Church in some regions, in which certain women are selected to dress the Virgin or to dress the Christ child. And so they spend much of their time making miniature clothing. This is not exactly miniature, more child-sized, but it is part of the installation. And this is once again the mirror for the Virgen de Guadalupe, which was the woman I was honoring. And on each side of the triptych in the two wings are images from the Castas paintings, which were in fact a part of the Spanish imposition in the New World and the categorization of the mestizaje, or mixing of races. So these Castas paintings actually brought these beautiful paintings to fruition that label the man, the wife, and the child. And there were over 54 of these categories of racial mixtures. So in some way, they were a subtle system of apartheid, but brought to light in the most beautiful paintings. So I included them in the Virgen de Guadalupe because the vestiges of these would still have been during Sorwana's time. Next. And this last image is the garden bench that we put together through stacks of slabs of granite to create our own resting place. Because one of the qualities of the enclosed garden was that the Virgin, often seen in religious paintings holding the infant Jesus, was relieved of the duty of motherhood, so that she might sit and read a book while other people took care of the baby, and she could be seen picking apples or simply contemplating her life. So we gave the Virgin her own bench. I just want to say in closing, in terms of the description of this, that I could simply not have done such a complex piece without the assistance of so many people at Williams College. And in fact, I think that's how the story of the garden and the library and all that became so legendary, because I engaged so many people in the process of making it. You know, trips out to the countryside, visiting garden shops, and generally making havoc and enjoying every part of it. I still miss it. It's been many, many years. It's one of my favorite memories of a residency and an installation.
Amalia, that's amazing. As someone who has not ever seen the installation before, it's so fantastic to have you walk us through the experience of making it, and to imagine just the museum so full of all of these amazing parts and pieces and collections, and such an incredible collaboration. I have a few questions to kind of start us off in conversation between the two of you, Amalia and Lisa, but I also want to take this moment to invite our audience to share questions that they might have about the rich and beautiful work that you do, and you can do that at any point during the rest of the program through our Q&A feature, and I'll be folding those questions in as we go. I think, want to start off with a question about what it means to care for the legacy of someone else. And Amalia, you have so beautifully walked us through so many of the people. I mean, Sarwana, your grandmother, yourself, you know, who are present in the making of this work that you created. And I'm thinking, you know, about also more broadly in your work, the way in which your practice is very much about exploring and caring for the legacy of other women, and particularly Chicana women. And Lisa, I'm thinking for you about in the curatorial practice, you know, what it means for you now as a curator working on a show to reprise part of this installation, and what it means for you to care as a curator for the legacy of an artist's vision, especially when working across time and across context.
Well, I'm going to start and say that I hadn't thought of it actually as legacy, although in reflecting back on the question that you sent me ahead of time, so I had time to think about it. I realized that in fact, my homenajes, I call them homages, which often came through the ofrendas honoring the dead. I had in fact been building one. I used to think of it more as a sort of community of history, because in the Chicano community at that time, and remember that I'm a first generation Chicana artist, which means that I came up in the 60s and 70s. And we were the first to treat the sort of cultural and artistic history as a way of giving ourselves a sense of origin. So my legacy making really was a survival technique. I think it's very hard for people to recognize now what it would be like to grow up in the United States in the 40s and 50s, when the term dirty Mexican was so in vogue and people could say it whenever they wanted. And so many of us in that first generation spend much of our time affirming our histories, building them in public spaces that they might be understood. So my early pieces for Dolores del Rio, Margarita Cancino, or Rita Hayworth, as you may know her, Santa Teresa de Avila, Sorwana Inez de la Cruz, and even Frida Kahlo. These were done in times where they might have been known to scholars, but they were not broadly known. And so as I developed them as a form of legacy making, I was in fact sharing that process with comadres of my own community who are now dealing with their legacy. So people like Carmen Lomas Garza, Esther Hernandez, Patsy Valdez, Judy Baca. Many of these artists helped me do this work by lending me everything from their hairbrushes and lipsticks for Dolores del Rio to their Holy Communion veils and first missals for my Venus Envy Chapter 1. All of these pieces then became a collective vocabulary of history making. We were claiming our own legacy as young women. We were trying very hard to give ourselves a kind of sensibility of belonging. And I myself, through my own developmental stages, was inhabiting their legacies as a way of emboldening myself, of giving myself confidence that I could finish my PhD, giving myself confidence that I could be a wife and an artist without being a mother. Frida Kahlo was my guide for that. So many of these women that I think of now as a sort of feminist homage were really my helpers. They gave me strength. They gave me a sense of purpose. And like my comadres, they gave us a sense of community. So I think in many respects, these practices that we developed were in some sense unspoken until we began to write about them. And this is really important to say, that when we began our work, we were the first to develop our own community organizations. We were the first to build educational and ethnic studies departments. We were the first to write. We were the first to curate, and we had to, because no one else would. And that is really, I think, the power of the legacy, is the idea that you have to give yourself your own truth. Otherwise, as a person in a disenfranchised situation, you will gain nothing if you don't do it yourself. So that's what we were doing. So I leave it to Lisa.
It's beautiful. Thank you, Amalia. And I'll add that, as a curator and you're working with a collection, you inherit these objects. They're here, and many of them have come under different circumstances and over different periods of time, and there were different motivations for why they entered, when they did, and so for me, it's important to kind of always, as much as possible, go back to the objects themselves and again see what it is they have to say about what they need, and when the artist is available to me, to try to work directly with the artist to make sure that that we're doing justice to the work. And because these objects were in the collection, one could imagine a scenario in which we just sort of put them on view, and we don't have specific instructions that were left at the time that they were acquired, but that just never felt like the right thing to do. So I was, like I said, in the, kind of my introductory remarks, I was so delighted to be able to connect with you directly, Amalia, because, these objects had a lot of mystery around them. It's sort of, I had images of what that looked like before, but I had no ability to recreate, all of it myself. There were so many pieces and parts that only you knew, and so what was really eye-opening to me was the conversation that we had, where we kind of talked about, well, what's the essence of this piece? What is the what absolutely must be there to provide the visitor, the viewer, with a sense of who Sorwana was and what your intention was in developing this library, like what were the essential components, and kind of break that down. And you were sort of doing that in real time, like you were thinking that through as we were discussing, in a way that is maybe the same, but maybe very different from what you might have said then when the work was acquired. Had they asked you for a very, specific list of guidelines about how it was shown, that might have looked the one way then, and maybe would look another way now, as you're heading into this moment of thinking about your survey exhibition and how all of your installations will kind of function together or speak to each other in different ways. And so, to me, that's the absolute ideal situation, and I value that opportunity. And that's really, the best in my work, the best I can do to care for these objects is to care for the continued engagement of the artist for as long as that's possible.
Well, I want to say it's been a really great pleasure for me. In the last 15 years, I've been working on my own archive, and Stanford just acquired it. And it was very hard to let it go because it was basically an age appropriate. I'm almost 80, so I was really looking back over my life, and now getting ready for the survey. I'm doing the same thing with the installations. And in fact, you gave me my first practice of looking back at a piece and what I intended it to be, how I installed it. And now, of course, many decades later, I have even a more maybe nuanced view of Sorwana and the way in which that piece, and it was very, and I know we're going to talk about it later, but it was very site specific because of the students who wrote to me and sent me videos. And then I realized, and I have to say this for people who don't know, 93 and 94 were the sort of years of campus insurrection and revolution. And in fact, I'd come from Cornell where it had happened. I'd come from UCLA where it happened. So I was really actually pleasantly surprised to find out that even at Williams, it was happening at that time.
I did want to ask about the site specificity, and I think this is a great time to do that. But I wanted to say too, I mean, I think hearing you talk about the installation, Amalia, I started to think also about not just site specificity, but sort of temporal specificity, and the way you described what you put on Sarwana's imagined desk, thinking about the kinds of the things in that contemporary moment of 1994 that Sarwana would be reflecting on and thinking about as a scholar. I think I'd love to talk a little bit about, what does it mean to take an installation that was made in a very specific time and place, and then think about, its continued legacy, the aspects of the work that now are in the museum's collection, now their sort of revival in the upcoming exhibition. Lisa, I'd love to hear you maybe talk too about what that means for you as a curator, and what kinds of ways you might be thinking about reprising this work in the very contemporary moment that we're in. And I think, Lisa, I mean, the Sweaty Concept Show too, I think you've been thinking and rethinking so much also about how our collection responds to the now. I mean, even over the past year or so. So maybe you can each speak a little bit about sort of the specificity of time and place.
Well, I was thinking a lot about it because it took me years to realize that I was doing site-specific work, because you have to really imagine that in the time that I started making work more, I would say more mainstream institutions, I started out in my community organizations first. It was like the 80s, the early mid 80s. And I didn't know about installation art because I'd never gone through an MFA program. I had an MA, 2 MAs and a PhD in psychology. And so I made work out of my own sort of curiosity and my own eccentricities, I guess I would have to say, my own way of doing things. So I didn't find out until I was fairly along that people were calling my work site specific. So then I had to figure out, what does that really mean? And what it meant in many respects is that I would arrive someplace, I had an idea, I had some pieces in process, but it was often largely done right there. The Holy Communion piece, which is part of the Venus MV that was done at the Little Whitney, I basically went a month early to the Bowery, bought a vanity, and spent a couple of weeks in the back of the gallery with tarps on the floor, painting it white, pearlizing it. So each time I went somewhere, I would go ahead of time, find the space, find the things that I thought would help me tell the story I was trying to do. But as I went along, I discovered, and this is sort of the idea of institutional practice, that museums run in a certain way. And when you're in a site-specific position, you are privy to many, many aspects of museum life that artists who send their paintings or sculptures never ever see. One, you get dragged here and there for various events, but what also you find about is how decisions are made in the museum world. And, you know, I have great affection for Jim Clifford's book, Predicament of Culture. So many of my interests in World's Fairs, the Wunderkammers, the Cabinets of Curiosity, all of that are part of that idea of stolen history. So in many respects, my site-specific work has also increased my politicization in the way in which I work. Sorwana wasn't one of those pieces, but in a way it was. And this is sort of one of those gossip stories, but I'm gonna tell it anyway. You know, I knew about Williams College. Everyone knows the Williams Mafia. It's a very derogatory term, but it really does mean that from Williams College graduate some of the powerhouses of the museum world. And I had an encounter with a museum director in San Francisco, and he arrived at Williams to see, he was probably just visiting. And Linda Shearer, who was my, I call her my curator, but she really wasn't. She was the museum's curator. He asked her, "Oh, are you showing Amalia Mesa-Bains?" And she said, "Oh," and she was so excited. "Yes, yes." And he said, "Did you have to?" And then I realized that in certain parts of the museum world, it was still thought that an artist like myself would only be shown if someone forced them to do it. And so those are the aspects of site-specific meant, of course, that I did get to see many things and work with various curators, find the objects I needed. Sometimes I sent them ahead of time, sometimes they were already made. But often it was a very on-the-spot set of interactions. And in Williams College, if it had not been your registrar who told me about the Spanish colonial collection, I wouldn't have found half the things that I needed for Sorwanas Library: the desk, the chair, the music bench, so many things. It would have been incomplete if I hadn't really had that interaction. Of course, Linda also provided wonderful young students who spent hours with me rolling on the wall, the wallpaper design and jeweling it. So site-specific is a very loaded term to me because it really means that a certain aspect of every installation is transformed by the process of being on that site. And so I've had them all the way from Dublin and Istanbul to, you know, places in Barcelona and Lyon. And each time something changes in my idea of what I intend to do by virtue of who I encounter and what I find there. So that to me is really the energy of a site-specific work. It's unpredictable. Sometimes it's corrupted. Sometimes it doesn't turn out the way you want because things change once you get there. So I'm sure for a curator, it must be even more compelling to work in a site-specific way with artists.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm thinking about the site and you know, the way that your work has to change to, you know, to sort of respond to each specific site. And, you know, we're talking about, you know, reprising at least an aspect of a much larger work in the same museum. It's essentially the same site. It's a different gallery space. But even if we were to say, try to reprise it in the original gallery space, that space has changed. When you did the installation in '94, the Stoddard Gallery that houses our Assyrian reliefs, the reliefs were walled over, and so one couldn't see them. And this, you know, for many years now, they've been on view, and it would vastly change your installation if we had to do it with the Assyrian reliefs in the space. You know, and so I think about the, you know, just the ways that the museum itself has changed. And, you know, your mentioning of, you know, the very many people who worked on the installation. And I think, you know, our curator of collections at the time, then Vivian Patterson, she she was the most knowledgeable about the collection of anyone, right? She was an encyclopedic, kind of resource of everything that was in the collection. And so I can only imagine that, any interest you might have shown in any topic, she would have been the one to kind of, say, okay, this is where, we have some of that and we have some of this. And I also know which gardens to go to dig up the foliage that you, that you need, right? So I can imagine, that in conjunction with the students, the graduate students and other students who worked on the exhibition, that, that was a team that was really very much about this place and this collection.
Oh, I'm really glad you told me that you're changing the space, because I kept thinking about the wainscoting. The whole reason that I developed that whole sort of full wallpaper rolled on jeweled thing that took hours and hours and hours, because I didn't know what else to do with the wainscoting. And I had to find a way to link the two rooms. So each section, the harem, the garden, and the library, had a different wallpaper pattern, a different coloring, and a different edging. But they were all very similar. So that but I had no idea there was something behind those walls. Amazing. Oh, I wish I could come for the new one to see how it's going to be.
Well, we're gonna, when it'll be with the piece, your piece will be in a different space anyway. But yeah, anytime we would love to have you in Williamstown. So.
I agree with that. I wanted to read aloud a comment from one of our attendees, Deborah Rothschild, who was in fact actually here during the installation. And I'll read aloud both her beautiful commentary and question. Deborah wrote to us, hi, I might be the only person listening who was there and participated in Amalia's amazing installation. Indeed, the entire museum staff was enlisted, and this show was where I first used a glue gun. I often think about the tremendous amount of scholarship that Amalia must have delved into to teach us about a heroine who had basically been lost to history, and also the very layered nature of the exhibition. And Deborah said, at the time, I was senior curator of exhibitions and had just finished a David Hammond show that had proved controversial. Your show was funded by the Lannan Foundation and was supposed to be part of the artwork series that was funded by that foundation. And Deborah actually was wondering if there was a brochure or catalog, and it was a shame if there wasn't. But I also would love to hear maybe, Amalia, you talk a little bit, I have a question kind of about some of your scholarship, but maybe broadly how this show might have intersected with some of the thinking that you have done in your scholarly thinking about art and practice.
I'm laughing to myself because I'm thinking, why is there no brochure? Because I insisted on expanding the show till I ate up the entire budget, which would have included the budget. And I kicked myself for it because, one of the things for me was the pride of following David Hammond, who's one of my idols that I, like everyone else, think is probably one of the great artists of our time. And so I had seen the brochure and I was so excited, but I just kept spending and buying and finding more and more things. And so I ate up the budget, and that was why there is no brochure. And I going through some images now for a book that's being made, and I feel so upset with myself every time I see these beautiful images that they didn't end up in the brochure. In a way, Sarwana was already part of this ongoing kind of legacy that we talked about. But I do have to say that over the years of pursuing women in the history of my community, it led me further along into the idea of writing more about the way in which Chicanas in particular made work and how they inhabited a feminist place. You have to recall, well, you don't because you weren't there, but we didn't use the word very well. There were only two women in my extended community that would have been the bridge between the white feminist community, and that would have been Judy Baca and Yolanda Lopez. And both of those women Yolanda, for example, had been with Martha Rossler at UC San Diego. Judy Baca was a peer of Judy Chicago, Suzanne Lacey, a number of other people. So they had their feet in both worlds. Most of us did not. We didn't necessarily even use the word feminist. Mujer work, or I mean, we tried to find different words for it, but we never really found a satisfactory one. I'm comfortable now with talking about my work within the lens of feminism, but I've written about it in one of the pieces I wrote for a show called California Art Women, was to try and track down what I saw as the feminist history of Chicanas, and it went through the labor movement. So we didn't take in Gloria Steinem or Bella Asbug or any of the others. It really had to do with contemporaries like Dolores Huerta, or historical figures like Emma Tenayuca, who led the Pecan strike in Texas, Josefina Bright, Luisa Moreno, many of them involved with the unions that were trying to protect women in the sewing factories. So our idea of feminism really came out of the struggle in the fields, the struggle for decent wages, the protection of women and children within those industries, because we were laborers. My mother was a maid, my father was a farm worker. Neither one of them had papers. They were undocumented until I was at CSUMB, and they were in their 70s and 80s. And I was already 50 before they got their citizenship. So many of us lived this interior life of a certain amount of anxiety. And that was really just about, once again, legalities, not belonging. So, you know, there's a lot of that aspect that I think really, it didn't obscure feminism, but feminism wasn't on the highest level of priorities in terms of what we were struggling for in the early years. I use the term now, I'm very comfortable with it, and I'm very happy to be in this show. I had to find out about sweaty. I did not know that term, but I've had a very sweaty life. I do know that. So I turn it over to Lisa.
Well, and I'm so glad Deborah's here too in the audience, because I'm thinking a lot about this in regards to our collection, in regards to museum practice, and I think about the moment, the particular moment in which you did your installation, Amalia, in '94. That was 5 years into Linda Shearer's tenure as director, and she was the first woman director of the museum. And then there was this kind of cohort of strong women curators. So Deborah, of course, and Vivian, who we mentioned, and Nancy Moe Matthews, who was the curator of American and European art. And these four women were leading this institution in a very different way than it had been led before. And really, I was talking to Linda actually not that long ago about this moment, and she used the word to describe what they were doing during this time as reparative, and kind of thinking about looking to cast a much wider or more inclusive net, and to tell different kinds of stories than the museum had told before. And so, of course, Deborah's David Hammond's exhibition was one of these kinds of moments, or later on, Vivian's Carrie Mae Weems commission, the Hampton Project, and these had such far-reaching and great impact. And they both augmented the collection, much like the installation that you did. So it's really, to me, kind of thinking about that moment and our current moment, and how we can continue to look at this, an institution of our scale with our deep history and this kind of wide-ranging collection that hits on so many different nodes, sort of our responsibility to kind of keep pushing ourselves in that direction. And so for me, this Sweaty Concepts has been an opportunity to kind of really look at the work that we have and to think, what's next for us? These works are did so much in their moment, and they still have a lot to tell us. But what do we need to do now to kind of continue to expand those histories and to tell different narratives? And so, my hope is that we learn by bringing these works together, bringing your work into dialogue with the other artists in the collection, that we're able to learn something about what we need to be doing now.
I wanted to maybe just bring us towards the end of the program with a final question that I think builds wonderfully on both of the things you're sharing. I wanted to ask you, Amalia, to talk to our audience a little bit about your idea of the domesticana. And I'm thinking about specifically, that which you talk about. I think you describe it as a defiant and inventive, kind of very specifically Chicana form of aesthetic expression. And I think, Lisa, I'm thinking also about, in what ways, can we think about collecting as a feminist practice? I think that's so present in your work, Amalia, and I think it's part of, the way in which your work I see is like resisting in its forms a kind of institutionalization. But like, what does it mean then to enter a museum's collection? And I think the conversation that we've had today and the work that you two have been involved with, I think, is really about this kind of negotiation in many ways between how an artist's work might work against an institution and also exist within it. So I'd love to sort of end there and wrap up. But if anyone else has other questions in the audience, we might have time for one more if you want to send it our way at the end.
Oh, domesticana. I actually wrote domesticana in a fit. I mean, most of the things that I've done in my life are usually in reaction to something that I find just insufferable, and I'm not going to put up with it. So I find a way to either do something about it through activism or writing, which I find another form of activism. Domesticana was really born out of an earlier work by my dear, dear colleague, Tomás Ibarra-Frausto, who, by the way, has finally finished my book, and hopefully by next year it'll be published. And so Tomás and I have had endless conversations. We were neighbors for almost 30 years, and he is the man who took what we all knew as a kind of cultural position, rascuachismo. When I was a child, people would say, oh, she's so rascuache, which was not a compliment. It meant she was sort of kind of put together at the last minute, and ultimately means making the most from the least. But I had always felt that Tomás' writing was stellar, but the application of it was never understood to be part of the way women in my community worked. So you could say that David Avalos, for example, is the king of rascuachismo. He took a lipstick, a hubcap, and made an amazing work of art out of it. So I wanted to write about the women. So I coined the term domesticana, talking about how within the patriarchy of the family and the community, which was vast even in the movement for social justice that we were all part of, we had within our own lives less of that than we should have had. And so it was about the domestic container, how you break out of it, how you don't undermine what you've learned. So you honor your mother and your grandmother, but you find ways to dispute the limitations placed on you. And defiance, I think of my own work as having a sort of dazzling defiance, a way of like putting it in front of you unmistakably. But I thought about the question of collecting as a feminist practice. And I started thinking, well, of course, women make space. They make space in their homes, they make space in their communities. And in the process of that circumscribing, whether it's through altars or ofrendas or healing spaces, there is a kind of remembering that which is dismembered, the things that have been taken from us, the things that have been disparaged, the things that have been denied. So the process, I think, of collecting is really like a practice of memory, of recollecting, of finding back the things you lost, of giving those bits and pieces of the past, the bits and pieces of your home and your environment, to honor them, to bring them back together, and to use them in some respects to open the next door. I've always talked about kicking open the door because I didn't know any other way to get to the next room, because I grew up in a time where museums simply had no interest in work from Latinos or Chicanos in the US. And so we built our own institutions, the Social Public Art Resource Center, the Galeria de la Raza, the Mexican Museum in Chicago and San Francisco, Self-Help Graphics, the Guadalupe Center in Texas. You could name them, they're legendary. And we built those because there was no other place for us to show. Now that was decades ago, and there's more and more work. And as we go into museums, we do face a kind of explaining routine where you have to tell people what it means in a way that I think sometimes other artists don't. They just make it and everybody says, well, this is valuable, but they never ask you artists to talk about it. I'm sorry, I don't think white men get asked to talk about their artwork, but we get asked all the time. And I feel that's okay because that's part of it. Even when I was doing the piece at the Fowler with Marla Burns, who I adore, and is one of the great curators of, the anthropological, the archaeological, the historical. She invited me for the 50th anniversary at the Fowler Museum at UCLA to do an altar, but I decided I wanted to do a Wunderkammer because I've been working through this whole historical investigation through libraries and laboratories, and the Fowler was my first big chance to work on a very large collection. I'd done a smaller one at Cornell, which was, well, very disastrous personally. It worked out well, but it was hard slog. I'd never do that again. But Fowler was different because they wanted me there, but I had to confront the reality that I was dealing with works that from the point of view of my community historically were stolen. And I wanted to do something of mestizaje. So I was talking about the tercer raíz, or the third root of Mexican culture, which is African. So my husband and I have been together 55 years. He's African-American. I'm third generation mixed race in my own family. So these issues were important to me. And the Fowler was the first time I could take them head on. But once again, you're contending with the reality that you're working through a space that had rendered you invisible. The beginning of the museum world in terms of halls of man versus museums, the anonymous artisan versus the masterpiece and the master painter. We knew who we were. We were the hybrid of two worlds that had never been together. And my generation was the first generation that landed in contemporary museums where they probably should have been in an early day placed in the Hall of Man. So I knew what we were doing. And it, luckily for me, once again, like working at Williams, I had the goodwill and the support of an enormous amount, actually the entire museum department, every single one of them worked on it. But I've learned that being in museums is partly a process of educating. And I started a project called Regeneration many years ago, almost 3 decades ago. And your Ondine Chavoya at Williams was part of that process, because I recognized back then, as did many of my colleagues, that museum life would never change if you expect a 60-year-old white man to give up everything that he has built his career and his economy around. You need to grow someone else, younger, who begins from the point of view of that diversity, inclusivity, and that sort of curatorial curiosity and intelligence. Women like yourselves, people who want to know what that is. And so I think this is a golden moment because of Black Lives Matters, because of the Latinx movement, Me Too movement. There's just so much that has preceded the moment we're in now, where people like myself and others in my generation are being approached for the first time by major museums to collect us. And my first reaction is always, well, where the hell were you 20 years ago when I needed this? But I've come to the realization, don't complain. This is what you wanted, not just for yourself. You wanted this for your community. You wanted somebody to say, this work, this history, this legacy, this cultural trajectory is part of American life. So, that's the point I'm at now. So I'm actually quite happy that the museum world is beginning to open up in a way that I think they weren't for sure 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. at least in respect to the Chicano and Latinx community.
I have nothing to add to that. I think that it just there. No, I think that you know, everything you said there, Amalia, is you know, exactly what I hope this, you know, this exhibition can bring to light, and the you know, having this program with you today is exactly, you know, what we were hoping, is to be able to surface these you know, these issues and these questions, and it's just a tremendous honor to be able to do this with you. So I thank you so deeply.
Oh, and you too. I'm thankful to both of you. And you, in my opinion, are young ladies. So it gives me fuel for the future.
I'll take it. That sounds good to me.
Really,
Thank you
really.
so much, Amalia. I really appreciate that. Yeah, that future look of optimism, which I, as a young curator, I think can feel hard to see sometimes. And so
Yes, I
it's
know.
really wonderful to hear that from you. I just want to thank you so much for your time and care, Lisa, Amalia. It's been such a pleasure to get to know your work, Amalia, so much more deeply through this process. I want to thank our wonderful audience today for being here, and for so many of the major players in the making of your work who are, I'm seeing their names as you're saying them here. It's beautiful to have all of you here. Thank you for all the care, all of the work you're doing, and we can't wait to, I can't wait, and I think we all can't wait, Amalia, to see your work up in this show that will be opening soon. And also, someone did ask about your survey show, and that will be coming up, I think, in mid-May 2023 at UC Berkeley. Is that right?
Actually, I think it's February 2023, Berkeley Art Museum Pacific Film Archive, and very exciting, 10,000 square feet. I'm all excited.
I can't wait.
And I'll probably fill every single piece of it.
Well, we can't wait for that too, and I'm just so excited to continue the conversations. And thank you all so much for being here today. We'll see you soon. Take care.
All right, thank you.